Hey, everyone. As many of you know, uh, a pastor in the Middle East, Dr. Aubrey Sequeira, has recently taken issue and critiqued the views that I give about the atonement at a recent conference conducted by Radius and in an interview on the Mission podcast. He specifically examines what I offer as a challenge in the crossing context. So, in response, I've written a blog and I've interacted on Twitter. And one of the things I said was that he misrepresented my views, that he was mistaken about my views. And so he was very kind to want to interact with me. He tweeted a few questions asking yes or no, do you believe this, this, and that? And he said, perhaps we can get this clarified. So that's what I'm doing here. Rather than just simply writing out the answers or doing a simple yes or no on Twitter, uh, we'll do it this way. Let me say, first off, that this book represents probably about 10 years of research. I enter this with some axe to grind. I simply was preparing for some classes I was teaching and kept seeing inconsistencies and questions that were just not being addressed, no matter where I looked. And so, one of the fundamental purposes of the crossing context is to examine more closely how the Bible uses particular words and metaphors. Now, I contend that people have a tendency to overlook the inherent logic of the text, or they routinely oversimplify or reduce the meaning of ancient rituals and language, typically in a way that conforms to our own cultural logic. And this is precisely why I included a discussion early on about how historical views of atonement have shifted and adapted slightly according to the popular understanding of justice of the time. This has been well documented. Okay, so this is not something new. It's been very clear that the church has emphasized different aspects of the atonement depending on how people simply saw the concept of justice. Okay, so I start off with that to simply help people come more flexible to realize, hey, this is a dynamic we need to take seriously. Now, Aubrey's questions are framed in problematic ways, not necessarily wrong in what they affirm, but insufficient in what they communicate. Not necessarily because he affirms a lot of wrong ideas, but he's, I think, wrong in some of the practical denials that may be implied in his question. So, without further ado, how about I get to the questions that he proposed, that he posed to me on Twitter, and I will answer him. Okay, the first question is this. He asked, do you affirm that his death, Jesus vicariously bore, that in his death, Jesus vicariously bore God's punitive justice and absorbed his righteous wrath toward sinners? This is a hard one to say yes or no to because there's some terms that need defining, need clarification. What I may say yes to, someone may say no to. What I would say no to, someone might say yes to. And that's precisely the point in the book. Let's look at one example that I highlight a lot. That's a significant point. Many scholars typically use the word bear or bore wrath or bore sin as if it's just so obvious what it means. Typically, people assume that bearing sin essentially means to endure punishment for one's sin. However, this is not necessarily true. In fact, Leviticus 5, 17, 18, a man bears his own sin, but he does not receive some sort of a punitive punishment. Now, many readers understand to bearing his iniquity, that phrase, to indicate that a man will be punished. By this logic, a person who is forgiven does not bear his sin. Yet, the man in the passage both bears his sin and is forgiven, interestingly. And verse 18, Leviticus 5:18, clarifies the way that the person bears his sin. What does he do? The phrase suggests that he bears responsibility for sin. It does not necessarily imply his being punished. It can indicate his dealing with the problem. Absolutely. That's what it's, but taking responsibility for sin is a broader term. It's a general gloss that I think helps elucidate or clarify the meaning of the important phrase. In specific context, however, this broad sense of to bear sin, to bear iniquity, intriguingly conveys two seemingly contradictory meanings. And numerous Old Testament scholars have observed this. On the one hand, the phrase could imply or connote suffering punishment for sin. But on the other hand, it can mean to forgive sin, or I should say, could connote that meaning. So in Exodus 34, 6-7, God proclaims, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity. Now that word forgiving in the English is actually, the Hebrew behind it is nasa, the word for bear, the exact same language where it talks about bearing iniquity or bearing sin elsewhere. Okay. But we typically see it translated out as forgiving. This is really common. Okay. Throughout the Bible, that same phraseology, bear sin, bear iniquity, has direct opposite meanings in different passages. Now, how is that possible? Seems a very odd use of language. Well, one scholar said the solution is, quote, as brilliant as it is ordinary. Now, keep in mind that this verb, nasa, this Hebrew word, is just simply a metaphor translated to bear or to carry. Okay. And metaphors draw their meaning from one sphere of life and they map it onto another, right? So I hit a home run. That takes from the baseball sphere, and to another, it may mean I did a great job. I really did a great job presenting or explaining something or whatever. Okay. It uses concrete objects and situations to help make sense of abstract ideas. So in this case, from one perspective, a person may bear or carry a burden, an obligation, a weight. And in that case, that burden could be painful. But in other situations, to say that someone bears a burden could highlight a different circumstance. Now, in that case, perhaps a second party assumes the first person's load, thus relieving or rescuing that person from some really burdensome, wearisome affliction. Okay. Now, both perspectives are not only legitimate ways of using the same metaphor to bear a burden, but they're pervasive throughout the Bible. Now, each usage, each kind of connotation has different emphases. Now, this verb, nasa, appears over 600 times throughout the Old Testament. Its just basic meaning is to lift, to raise, to bear, to carry, all right? And so both of these meanings are so extremely common. But the reason why they tend to be unfamiliar to us is because over and over again, English translations simply say forgive instead of God bore their sin. Okay. Now, how do we tell the difference? Where bearing entails punishment or something like that from passages that may have a salvation or forgiveness connotation. Now, in the Bible, we see a consistent pattern that should, I think, govern our interpretation of the metaphor. Whenever someone bears their own sin, iniquity, transgression, guilt, whatever, the connotation is typically something negative or punitive. The verbiage implies that the person will suffer some sort of pain or punishment. However, when the Bible introduces an innocent second party who bears the burden on behalf of a guilty person, the emphasis, the stress there, the connotation changes entirely. The language carries a positive connotation. It concerns salvation, where the guilty person is relieved from the burden. And not only that, there is no unambiguous example in Scripture where this bearing language indicates that an innocent second party is punished in place of or instead of the offender. Here again, there is no unambiguous example where bearing language indicates that the innocent second party is punished in place or instead of the offender. Okay. You can't say, what about Jesus? That's the entire point. That's what we're debating. So you can't assume the conclusion by saying, well, doesn't it say Jesus bore our sin, he was punished? Well, we got to wait and see, what does the word mean? When they use that language, what does it mean to say Christ bore our sin? Okay. So we don't want to ignore this point, the fact that there's no unambiguous example. And as overwhelmingly, it has a saving positive connotation. Now, since theologians traditionally emphasize that first option, the bearing as punishment, I probably should use an analogy to help explain the second. Imagine like Les Miserables. Maybe you have a criminal who's sentenced to forced labor, and his work means he has to carry agonizing loads of rock in and out of the mines. One day, his foreman decides he wants to show compassion on the criminal. So the foreman takes like a wheelbarrow, a cart, to bear away to remove the criminal's burden. Now, in this example, there's nothing inherent to the metaphor that requires us to say that the second party, that is the foreman in this case, suffers the punishment as a substitute in the exact same way that the criminal was bearing the load. So what does this mean about Christ, bearing our sin? Well, I can't unpack it here. I dive into it in the book. But in light of just that simple little point there that I've made, we need to interpret the Bible's language the way the Bible uses its language. So that where we see a person bearing sin, that phrase by itself is ambiguous. We have to ask, well, is that person bearing their own sin, or are they bearing someone else's sin? And since we see a very, very consistent pattern, then it would seem to indicate that to bear wrath or sin or whatever else in one case might be to be suffering for it. But in the other case, if it's you're an innocent party bearing the sin or wrath for on behalf of another, you're taking it away, you're removing it. And again, no unambiguous examples. Even if there might be one, I don't know if there's one, I haven't found one yet. Overwhelmingly, there is no connotation where it says that second party is being punished instead of that person. Okay, so this question of the meaning of bear can't be assumed, but people all the time read ancient church fathers, read theologians, read the Bible, and they just assume that what bear means. Okay, so yes, I think Jesus vicariously bears God's punitive justice. That is, he removes it, because that's the way the Bible uses that language. Now, what about absorbed? Well, the goal of my book is to help us to remain as close as possible to the Bible's own language. Absorbing righteous wrath is just not biblical language. It might be true, it might not be, but it's not the Bible's language. And that's what I'm trying to call us back to. Let's see how the Bible uses terms. I would prefer to use biblical language, the biblical language that often translates to appease. The word absorb adds an additional layer of interpretation and even a switching of metaphors that is not clearly required or even suggested by the biblical authors. Okay. So one of the important discussions I do actually have in the book concerns the meaning of appease, the original language that translates appease. And I do argue that it has this idea of entreating God's favor. Now, it's not an either or. To entreat God's favor does include the idea of appeasing God's anger. Absolutely. So I don't deny that. But to entreat is broader, because we do see instances where this language is used in the Bible where there's no issue of anger involved. Okay. Again, I'm trying to see, how does the Bible use this language? It's not that I'm saying there's no place for appeasing God's anger. Not at all. It's just I'm trying to help us see the broader ideas that are being conveyed here so that we can understand what is necessarily true, what is possibly true, and what is possibly not true. Okay. Now, he talks about vicariously, Jesus vicariously bearing God's justice, and talks about righteous wrath. I clearly and overwhelmingly affirm that Christ is our substitute. He is our representative. And I absolutely affirm God's wrath. I have half a page at least where I ask the question, okay, what about God's wrath? You're wondering what? And I just give a long verse after verse after verse showing, yes, all sinners deserve punishment. Yes, Christ saves us from the wrath of God. Yes, God will fully inflict his wrath on those who dishonor him and don't repent. Okay. Jesus delivers us from the wrath to come. First Thessalonians 1:10. No question about it. Okay. Because God is righteous, he must set the world right. So to say that I don't believe in God's punitive justice is false. To say that that I think that Christ doesn't vicariously rescue us from God's wrath, that's false. Absolutely do affirm God's wrath against sin. Okay. His second question: penal substitutionary atonement, as described above, is the heart of the gospel message, providing the divinely revealed logic of how Christ achieves atonement and accomplishes redemption on behalf of his people. Do you agree with this statement? Yes or no? Well, I need to be clear. The heart of the gospel is Jesus is king. He is the Christ. He is the Messiah. That's the heart of the gospel. So I don't want us to confuse the gospel for a full-orbed doctrine of salvation. They're obviously intertwined. They cannot be separated, but we need to confuse what was the central message that was conveyed every single time. That is, Jesus is king. And then they unpack that. What does it mean that he was king? Well, he defeated death. How? He died and was resurrection. And what does that mean? He overcame sin, right? He brings forgiveness, right? That's what a king does, right? And then you have to keep unpacking that more and more to understand what are the mechanics behind that. You get to the atonement, okay, and this glorious salvation that we have. Okay, we need to distinguish the gospel itself, that Jesus is God's king, okay, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, okay, that royal message. Okay, remember, you may or may not remember the term gospel in the ancient world. That was actually a term for a royal proclamation of who's king and a king's victory, right? We need to distinguish that royal declaration with the theology that supports and surrounds and emanates from the gospel. Okay, this is when people ask, well, is the doctrine of salvation, how we get saved, the gospel? It's a yes and no, because the analogy I give, it's like asking if this right here, my hand, if this is my body. Well, yes, it is my body, but to say this is my body is not to say this isn't. Okay, so it all depends on exactly what do we mean. All right. Yes, it's the gospel in some sense, but it's not the most narrow centerpiece proclamation that is Jesus King. Okay. So I'm not saying it's not the gospel. It's just we have to understand where our limits are, right? Because an entire full-orb doctrine of salvation is not necessarily the gospel. Like, what is the meaning, the nuances of glorification and sanctification? Well, eventually we get to a point where we go, okay, we're leaving the absolute center and getting to this broader understanding of the gospel. It's much, 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 much bigger. So, penal substitutionary atonement, rightly understood, though, does not exhaust the logic of how Christ accomplished redemption. So, is penal substitution a part of that logic? Yes, but I wouldn't say it's exhaustive of that. Understanding the Bible's inherent logic is precisely the point of the book, The Cross and Context. My contention is that we typically come to the text either with a limited understanding of the biblical terms, okay, like the word bear that I just went over, or we have some flawed premises about how words and metaphors and context work. Our logic is only as good as our premises and the breadth of our understanding. This is why I'm trying to bring us back to the text. I get extremely exegetical. And so if I would beg anyone, if you want to challenge the things, I'm saying challenge the arguments I make, go and interact with the text that I interact with. I would love to be shown which text I'm interpreting wrong. I'd love to see where people think I'm getting it right. The third question: are the legal judicial categories of Scripture, such as guilt, retributive justice, righteousness, primary and foundational for our understanding of how the cross of Christ accomplishes atonement? Yes or no? There's a little bit of a problem here. This is a trick question because the Mosaic Law is the container for the many, many metaphors related to atonement. So at one level, yes, there is a primariness to it. But guilt, retributive justice, and righteousness are not exhaustive of legal and judicial categories, right? Yes, they are primary and foundational, but they're not the only ones that are primary and foundational. I mean, these concepts are necessary for sure for a robust biblical theology, but they're not sufficient to explain how the biblical authors themselves articulate the gospel or articulate the atonement. So also, purity language, payment imagery, and the metaphor of bearing a burden. These are also primary and foundational. I mean, these are the consistent three metaphors that you always see tied explicitly to atonement language. I show that again and again and again in the book. In fact, these three metaphors are intertwined. So it's not like I'm trying to tear these apart. We need to be aware of reductionist theories of atonement that pick and choose one metaphor over others, whether we're talking legal language, purity language, whatever language, they're intertwined. One of the objections I have in the critique and even in these questions, that Aubrey does not engage the extensive and detailed exegesis that I provide in the book that would help to answer these questions. Okay. He merely critiques me based on whether I draw the same conclusions as he does, not actually interacting with my arguments about how the Bible uses these terms. Okay. So do I affirm penal substitution? Yes. But what do I mean by that? Well, I affirm these things: that Christ's sacrifice, his death, affects atonement, right? And there's the chapters where I explain that. Christ bears our sin. Christ's atonement pays a penalty that stems from our sin, okay? Christ's atonement involves substitution. He is our substitute, and he is our representative. And Christ's atonement appeases God's wrath. Okay. Now, you say, I mean, are these not that each one of these, this is exactly, no matter what kind of version of penal substitution someone has had in the past, these are the things that we want to affirm, right? Now, the real question is this, and this is the big rub. Does affirming these points does it demand the claim or the belief that God the Father punishes Christ the Son? That's the real point key of the debate. I think that you can affirm each of these things. Christ can die on our behalf as a substitute, bearing our sin, paying the penalty for our sin, appeasing God's wrath, yet without having to say that God the Father punishes his innocent son. If God does that, then okay, that's what he does. But we don't have clear evidence that that's the case. And I want us to come to have an honest conversation about the terms we're using and the text we're using to debate whether or not that conclusion, that assumption is sufficiently biblical, or is it only that we arrive at that conclusion because we haven't looked closely at specific text, the logic of the metaphors, and the language. Okay, so yes, I affirm penal substitution, every single one of these things. Okay, he is our penal substitute, no question about it. But in order to understand what that means, we have to look at the Old Testament language, not just the New Testament, the Old Testament language from which the New Testament draws. We have to see, how does atonement work? What does it mean to be a sin offering and whatnot? Okay, the New Testament's atonement theology draws explicitly and overtly from the Old Testament, but too many New Testament scholars don't, I think, go deep enough into that. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. I've answered the questions. Again, this is not a casual work of theology. I try to dig in. I tried to address and engage every single text I could find that dealt with penal substitutionary atonement. Now, this book is not only or merely about penal substitutionary atonement, but that is one thing that I addressed. All right, we need to have a more robust understanding of how the Bible itself engages in this conversation. Why? Because I've seen again and again that so often the way that theologians talk about atonement and the way that a lot of biblical scholars talk about atonement when they're in the text seems so different. And I wanted to say, why is that? Why does it seem like they're having two different conversations? I'm hoping this book can help bridge that gap. I hope I've answered these questions, these tweets sufficiently. I hope that you find it helpful. Thanks.